What was your original involvement with 3M?
Well, I started out in production, on the production floor, troubleshooting. I went from bench test to system test pretty quickly. And then after probably not much more than a year or so, was able to migrate into the field service department, and which of course was a great opportunity for me because it allowed me to kind of see the outside world, which was quite big. 3M, of course, had a lot of instrumentation machines and contracts with Army, Navy, military, security agencies, research universities, and whatnot. And then, of course, they were beginning their foray into the audio market, and
tape.
Yeah, so got to go down to the Capitol recording studios of the world and whatnot, and get introduced to the recording scene. And then after, when I was just doing that for a while, one day I was out on the shop floor, doing some checking into what was going on, and I looked, and there was this seemingly older gentleman, and he introduced himself as Jack Mullen.
Jack Mullen.
And which, of course, that didn't mean anything to me at the time, and but of course wasn't too long after that he invited me to join him in the lab, the audio lab, and so that kind of changed my life forever, so to speak.
Yeah. So you didn't actually meet Jack Mullen in the armed forces, you met him at 3M.
Yes. Yeah. Right out on the shop floor. And
wow.
At that time, what was happening was that Jack was still living in St. Paul, where when Bing Crosby Enterprises was purchased by 3M in probably around 1956, they moved all the R&D people to St. Paul because that was 3M's policy, was that all R&D was done in the company headquarters back in Minnesota. And but Jack had gotten married very late in life, and unfortunately, him and his wife had decided to adopt children rather than have children, and no sooner had the adoption papers on the third child been signed when his wife came down with cancer and died very quickly after that. So Jack was a little bit tired of being in St. Paul, and he kind of had tendered his resignation when 3M said, "Oh no, you can't be leaving, and we'll move you and your lab back to California." And so that was what he was in the process of, was relocating to California and setting up his lab there in the building. And so I got to join him, and like I say, it was a life-changing event.
Where in California was that?
Camarillo, California.
3M moved Jack and his entire lab to Camarillo.
Right, from St. Paul.
Now, if memory serves me, Jack Mullen brought back the original magnetophones as war relics from Germany.
That's right. He had come across them when he was in the Army Signal Corps, and during World War II, and at the close of the war, he kind of looked around and he kind of heard these. There was some curiosity among him and some of the other technical people as to how the Germans were able to, seemingly get the orchestra to play through the middle of the night, because as far as the rest of the world knew, there was no very low distortion recording methodology that existed, and mainly because the use of AC bias on tape recorders.
Hysteresis, right?
Well, linearizing the transfer characteristic, yes. So at any rate, when they went around, he heard these stories that, you should go to Radio Luxembourg, I don't know, wherever he was going to see. And so the Germans had perfected the use of AC bias in magnetic tape recording, maybe even prior to the war, but certainly during the war. And So he came across the magnetophones. He made his reports to the, I don't know, Army security people or whatever it was about it, and then he was able to ship some parts back to the U.S. or something. And when he returned, then he built his own, chassis or whatever it was. I'm not sure exactly.
Wasn't it? I thought it was Alexander Panaitov who reinvented the magnetophone for Bing Crosby, or was it Colonel Mullen, or both of them?
Well, Jack had given some demonstrations of his rebuilt magnetophones, and Panaitov, who was the head guy of Ampex, and at that point Ampex was only a small company, less than a dozen employees. And they had, during the war, been making motors, for making the flaps go up and down on the airplanes and so on and so forth. And so the war had closed, and they were, of course, anxious to find ways to generate income in the post-war era. And so he had seen Jack's demonstrations, and that struck the interest from the Ampex's standpoint of getting into the recording business. Of course, Jack demonstrated them also for the radio networks in Los Angeles, and specifically to Bing Crosby. And when that happened, he was given an almost instantaneous contract to start recording the Bing Crosby show. And then, of course, because they only had these two machines, eventually they had a malfunction, and motors, burned out or whatever. And I don't know if the story was true or not, but I heard the story of Jack taking the motor out of one of the machines and driving up to Ampex at Redwood City and sleeping in the lounge while they rebuilt the motor, and and then he came back. And so through those connections, Ampex became aware of tape recording, and of course we know that the story is that ultimately Ampex and 3M were two of the major companies that did the tape recording.
And they ran out of tape, I understand, because they spliced the original magnetophone tapes too often, and then 3M, I believe, was the first manufacturer of magnetic tape, correct?
Yes, I believe the 111 or 210, whatever, they made the first in the U.S. I think there were other companies that were attempting it, but I think 3M was one of the first that had a successful formula. But yes, initially Jack had packed several rolls of tape in a bag and just brought it back with him, and so that tape that he had was recycled. And when they were finished with accumulating a master for a show, they essentially cut it to a disc, a transcription disc lathe, and that became the master. And then they essentially re-recorded over the same tape over and over again, right? Which was quite a feat to do, because back then there was no backing. That German tape had no backing. It was just the oxide and some kind of an adhesive to hold them together.
So it probably fell apart pretty quick over time.
It was amazingly durable, because they were doing these shows, day after day after day. They did a whole season that way.
Wow.
And but of course the tape was eventually, because when he'd splice the tape together for a show, then when he'd get done, because the splices were a difficult thing to get to go through the machine, he'd go through and cut the splices out, as much as he could, and then put new ones in, because the tape of the day, they were just using Scotch tape, I guess, or whatever the version of Scotch tape was. And of course, we all know how Scotch tape over time, the adhesive kind of starts drifting to other places.